I pay homage to the Buddha. I pay homage to the Dharma. I pay homage to the Sangha. So it being Mother's Day today, I thought I would begin with a reading of two very short suttas that are often read together in the Anguttara Nikaya. These ones are 2.31 and 32, known collectively as gratitude, or katanyu in Pali. Actually, gratitude would be katanyuta. Katanyu would mean to be grateful or grateful. And it begins, monks, I will teach you the level of a person of no integrity and the level of a person of integrity. Listen and pay close attention. I will speak. As you say, Lord, the monks responded to him. The Blessed One said, Now, what is the level of a person of no integrity? A person of no integrity is ungrateful and unthankful. This ingratitude, this lack of thankfulness, is advocated by rude people. It is entirely on the level of people of no integrity. A person of integrity is grateful and thankful. This gratitude, this thankfulness, is advocated by civil people. It is entirely on the level of people of integrity. I tell you, monks, there are two people who are not easy to repay. Which two? Your mother and father. Even if you were to carry your mother on one shoulder and your father on the other shoulder for 100 years, and were to look after them by anointing, massaging, bathing, and rubbing their limbs, and they were to defecate and urinate right there on your shoulders, you would not in that way pay or repay your parents. If you were to establish your mother and father in absolute sovereignty over this great earth, abounding in the seven treasures, you would not in that way pay or repay your parents. Why is that? Mother and father do much for their children. They care for them, they nourish them, they introduce them to this world. But anyone who rouses his unbelieving mother and father, settles and establishes them in conviction, rouses his unvirtuous mother and father, settles them and establishes them in virtue, rouses his stingy mother and father, settles and establishes them in generosity, rouses his foolish mother and father, settles and establishes them in discernment. To this extent, one pays and repays one's mother and father. And so now I return back to the microphone, because I can't hold a microphone and a book at the same time. But I wanted to share those passages to tie a few ideas together. What it means to be a person of integrity, what it means to have the appropriate sense of thankfulness and gratitude for what we've been given and how we've been given it, to be right here where we are in the present moment. And then to also look at what it means to pay or repay our mothers and fathers on today, Mother's Day. You know, oftentimes we find examples throughout Buddhism that point to the fact of our indebtedness to those that brought us into the world, because here we are. And it's because that we're here we're able to develop in this path and become people of integrity in the first place. But oftentimes we find examples that seem quite comical, like what we just found, you know. The very idea of someone having amazing strength. I mean, by the way, having both parents on just each shoulder like they're both giant pigeons or something, or parrots or something. And you're just taking care of them as you walk around with them on your shoulders for 100 years, and much like a pet bird, you know, just right there on your shoulder. I once knew a guy like that who had a pet parrot he took everywhere with him, and his shoulder looked pretty much like you would expect someone who had a bird on his shoulder all day to look like. It seems really unpleasant. I can only imagine it was a full human being there. But we have that one example of what it would mean if you just carried them, carted them around wherever you went, and you looked after their every need. Even then, you couldn't possibly repay them. But then, even further, there's the idea of if you were in a position of power to set them up as sovereign of the earth, you can give them all the gold, all the riches, all the power, set them up as lords and ladies of the realm, kings and queens of the universe. That still wouldn't be enough. And then the Buddha says, well, you know what would be enough? And then that's where it gets to something quite interesting. Because within Buddhism, we often find this sort of dichotomy that the Buddha presents. There's the kind of things that we usually think lead to happiness and what actually leads to happiness. And so there's all the sensual pleasures of the world and all the riches that we might have. And we often think that that'll lead to any kind of true and lasting happiness for us. And the Buddha says, not so. It's having a mind that's free, unburdened, not attached, not craving, not clinging. That's what leads to peace. And so I think it's quite apt that in his example here, he goes, yeah, you could set them up as kings and queens, sovereigns, and that wouldn't do it. But we tie two ideas together. If you're a person of integrity and you're able to show that in your actions and what you think and what you say and what you do, then you might be able to lead by example and in some way maybe inspire parents who aren't like that. Or parents who are like that, you might make them very proud. They can see what kind of person they've brought out into the world, introduced into the world, as the Buddha said. And when we think about the life of the Buddha, I think that this kind of advice is so interesting. You know, we have to remember that when the Buddha was born, his mother died a week later. As we think about Mother's Day, we think about someone who didn't actually get to be raised by his actual mother. He was raised by his aunt, who then raised him as her own. And his aunt raised him as her own son, and he thought of her as a mother, but also an aunt. But he had a lot of affection for her, and he was actually in the position to do a lot of the advice that he said there. She was established as the first nun of the Bhikkhuni order. But I do think about that, you know, the fact that he wasn't able to actually be around his own parents all that much. His own mother, he just spent a week with her as an infant and then she was gone, and he never actually got to know her. And then with his actual father and then his stepmother throughout his life, he was gone by the time he was a young man. In the Pali Canon, we read that by the time he went off into his life as a samana, he was still, the way he described it, he still had black in his hair. He hadn't gone gray or anything yet. He was a young man, still strong and young and virile and everything. So he wasn't one of those old guys that goes off into the woods to kind of go out there and figure things out right before he dies. He was a young man who had his life ahead of him and went off into the woods instead to meditate. All right? And so he had the things that perhaps we might often think actually lead to happiness and would be the kind of things you could repay your parents with. He was born into a very wealthy family. Historians debate on whether he was actually a prince, but he was definitely someone of high station in the world with a lot of resources that he could have kept and held on to and shared with his parents and made their lives very easy. But instead, he chose the life of a renunciant, and then later on in life, he came back into their lives and taught them in some way. His father, he taught on his father's deathbed. His stepmother, he established as a nun, and so in that way, he was able to do exactly what he had set out to do in this example. He helped them become people of integrity after he himself had become a person of integrity. Now, that's a very lofty example, one that we might feel we fall short on if we don't really view ourselves as people of integrity, or we're people of integrity in training, let's say. But in framing it this way, I don't want it to make it seem like taking care of your parents is not enough. It's actually a great thing to be able to do, you know. What we see in this example is that someone of integrity has the very capacity to feel grateful, to feel thankful for what they have. and to want to repay it in some way and to find reasons to repay it. I think oftentimes when we find these examples of what it means to be a renunciant, what we find in someone who's free of craving and clinging, who has liberated themselves, is that all these other things are lesser and then therefore trivial. And that's not exactly the case. When we talk about what it means to take care of others, we often look at the example of what we give to bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, the requisites. We make sure that they are clothed, we make sure that they are fed, we make sure that they have medicine, and that they have a home. And sometimes we're fortunate enough to be able to do that for our loved ones as well, provide a place for our parents. I often think about my aunt, this is my paternal aunt, who has spent so much of her life taking care of my grandparents as they're now getting elderly. She even made her life simple enough to take care of them. And she'll probably disagree with me when I say simple, but what I mean is that she works from home and she has a nice big house and she has a nice little room right next to the living room. That's my grandparents' bedroom now, and my grandparents get to spend every day living quite luxuriously under the care of my aunt. And so that's a great thing to do. But sometimes we're not in that position. We're not around our loved ones. We might be very far apart. Our loved ones may be gone. And also, one thing that I thought might be important to bring up is that we also live in a time when families are often broken, estranged. There are really difficult relationships. Some people don't even have a good enough relationship with their parents to talk to them on a regular basis, if at all. And so how do we repay the people that brought us into the world? And to look at it in that respect. Not all of us had great childhoods, not all of us had parents that maybe did everything right, but we can at least have this sense of gratitude that we are here right now, today, right here. That means that someone, could have been anybody, but someone, when we were an infant and completely defenseless and completely without any ability to take care of ourselves, fed us, changed us, cared for us, made sure there was a roof over our head, something. But somebody brought us into this world. And so now we're in a position to have a life and do what we can with what we have. And for those of us here today, the ability to practice the Eightfold Path and to become people of integrity, like the Buddha says. And so I often think about how important it is to repay people through being someone of integrity. What it means to be out in the world and to do good in thought, word, and deed. So I was told to keep today kind of short, and my reflections are on just these two passages as I think about what it means for myself, who also had a difficult upbringing and doesn't really get to talk to his parents very much. And so I think about what it means to repay the people that I love but have difficulty being around with. And so I value what the Buddha has to say on this, that we don't repay these debts that we have to each other as human beings through material goods, beyond requisites, beyond things that keep us living. But all the gold and all the massages and all the power, that's not enough. I mean, think about all the horrible people out there in the world who have plenty of all of those things, right? There are people today who are very bad people and they've got enough money to take care of their parents financially, and they do. But that's not enough to repay anything. That's just enough to spread more money around and create more disparity, and we see that. I think we do more good in the world by being generous, by being kind, by being loving and open people. And that's how we make a legacy worth passing down. We live in a time when people are very much trying to understand the intergenerational trauma in their families. There's a lot of pain. every family, I've come across, every person I've talked to, there's always someone with some kind of skeletons in their closet. There's always some troubled person in their family, be a grandparent, uncle, whatever, aunt, cousin, something. So it might not be with our own families that we're able to actually create good, but we can create good in ourselves by being people of integrity. And that good gets spread around in every interaction. Well, for those of us who have loved ones who are gone, either their parents left when they were very young, or now because of age, they don't have their own mothers and fathers around. Maybe most of their family is also gone. How do you repay it to someone who's not around anymore? And I think that one of the ways you repay it is through the very act of generosity to others. Being giving, not just financially, not just through the things that were listed there, but even just being generous with yourself, to be open, to be helpful, to be around others. In truth, it's kind of a double-edged sword for me to be able to be up here on Mother's Day, because this is one of those examples where I'm definitely on the very edge of practicing what I preach. I'm in the very act of learning how to understand my own family, its past, and the traumas there, and the difficult relationships there. It means a lot to know that we have someone like the Buddha being a teacher that shows that example, that it's not always about what we think is the way we repay them, having to be this kind of subservient person, lugging people around on your shoulders and letting them literally, excuse my language, shit all over you. But instead, you can learn that you can repay the people who have brought you to where you are in this moment by just being a good person. So that's, I guess, my very short message for today. If we want to practice a good Mother's Day, a good Father's Day, and every day, we do so the same way we do every other day, by just being a good person. Be a person of integrity, right? So that's my very short message, so we can get on to a lot cooler stuff like playing with flowers. Thank you very much.